that Congress is not smart enough. They're not experts in the field that they would need to be in order to make a determination on whether a rule or regulation was needed. That's always been their pushback. And the second thing has been, it's going to be a lot of work. It's going to be a lot of work. And I have heard that both publicly in debate as well as privately when I get pulled aside and they say, this is going to add weeks to our schedule up here. Like, nobody has time for this. And I'm thinking, you SOB, oh my gosh, I clean that up for you, Jeff. I get infuriated because I grew up the daughter of a single mom who worked her tail off. And, to this day, we work, I believe, harder than anyone. We want to, of course, believe that. We always are our own competition. And it kills me.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
Well, thanks for joining us for another episode of American Potential. Our founding fathers set the framework for how our government is supposed to operate by putting checks and balances in place. And they did this by creating three different branches of government, like three legs of a stool. It keeps everything balanced. The administrative state under the executive branch has grown over the decades and makes rules and regulations that hold the same weight as a law. But the people making them, they aren't accountable to Americans. So is there any way to make these agencies accountable to voters? There's been a first step with a Supreme Court decision that took away the administrative state's ability to interpret ambiguous laws. Now, that's great news for Americans. Even with this decision, there's still work that needs to be done to limit government overreach. There's a bill in Congress called the Reins Act that would also help rein in the administrative state and allow Americans to have their voices heard on proposed regulations. Now, the sponsor of this bill is also working on another bill that would allow Americans to have more freedom and options when it comes to their health care needs. I want to welcome Congresswoman Kat Cammack back to the show. Congresswoman, thanks for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jeff. Glad to be with you.
Well, you bet. Now, first of all, let's tell folks where you're from. You're from the great state of Florida, who, by the way, knows how to do elections. I mean, they're the gold standard now in elections, it seems, right? I mean, they were the butt of many jokes back in 2000. But I really think Florida has become the model here, don't you?
That's okay. Everyone says "Make America Florida," so we're very used to that slip up. I know, but you're right. I mean, we have absolutely gotten it right after getting it wrong for so long. I think I remember at one point in time in the early 2000s, I was a hanging Chad for Halloween. I think folks who were alive then, which it's hard to believe at this point in time that we now have college students who weren't alive when 9/11 happened, and it's hard to wrap your head around, but yes, over the years, we have gotten it figured out. And it's still hard to believe that it is early December and California is still counting.
I know. It's
and
crazy.
Here we are in Florida, 2 time zones, and we have everything figured out by 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah, it's
every
great.
single race.
That's the way elections should be. We should know on election night whether, who's won, who's lost, those sorts of things. No doubt.
Yeah.
But let's talk about this. When we talked to you last at the beginning of this year, the Supreme Court hadn't made their ruling on Chevron and Chevron Deference, but they did overturn Chevron Deference. And let's talk about that. Why was this an important first step to rein in the administrative state?
Oh my gosh, Jeff, this is my love language. So excuse me while I nerd out for a hot minute. But when everyone talks about draining the swamp, they always think that the way to do that is through term limits. And while term limits are important, we were given term limits by our founding fathers, right? And they explain that every 2 years you can hire or fire your elected representative. What I've tried to explain for years at this point is that the real threat to our constitutional republic, it's the unelected, nameless, faceless bureaucrats that dwell in basements all over Washington, D.C. I mean, these people are accountable to no one. You can never find them. You can never figure out what their next thing is going to be. And they just absolutely have become the fourth branch of government. And dare I say, one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, because what they do is they not only make the law, they enforce the law, and then they're judge and jury on that law. Now, under the case Loper-Bright that was brought before the Supreme Court, that actually was a good first step and a very big one that said under the Chevron deference that had been going on, that where the agencies were given deference to interpret these rules and regulations. And I say rules and regulations, but in many cases, these rules and regulations are so big and broad and sweeping that they oftentimes would be billions of dollars in economic impact, wipe out entire industries, hamstring entire industries, and look no further than energy, for example, which is the core foundation of our economy, right? When Biden came into power, they didn't pass any laws that said they were going to hamstring domestic energy production. They did it through the regulatory regime. And I call it a regime because up until this point, it's been accountable to no one. And so when you have all of these regulators, these bureaucrats that are operating with immunity effectively, with no one to answer to, they get very powerful and it gets very corrupt. And what the administration had done up until this point had figured out that when they didn't have control of Congress, meaning the House and the Senate collectively, because Republicans took the majority, they figured out, well, we don't need them to actually make the laws. We're just going to execute this in our political agenda through administrative power, through the regulatory regime. So every political promise, every campaign promise that Biden had ever decided he was going to make, he did so through the executive branch, through the administrative state. And it's very dangerous because it's unchecked. So with Chevron deference, that was the way that they were able to do it. Now, the Supreme Court, of course, this summer, they ruled and said that no longer can agencies be the judge and jury. They can no longer be the final arbitrator of what that regulation or rule would do. And that was a critical first step. So it basically put one hand behind their back. I'm just trying to paint this in a way because so many of us could talk about this all day long. But for people who are unfamiliar, imagine those regulators, those bureaucrats now with one hand tied behind their back. What we have to do now as Congress is reassert our Article 1 authority, which our founding fathers, they made our legislative branch, Congress, Article 1, because it is by far the most important. That's how they envisioned it. And so now, as you mentioned, REIN's Act, that gives us the opportunity to rein in this administrative state, which if you're just getting down to brass tacks, it's $2 trillion every single year that we, the taxpayers, are paying in compliance and enforcement of these rules and regulations. And if that wasn't a big enough number to blow your mind, 2 trillion with a T, imagine the 90,000 pages of regulations that make up our every existence. Every service, product you can think of is regulated in some form or fashion in those 90,000 pages. And I'll tell you, most of it, it's just pure trash. So this is a really unique, incredible, and very important moment that we have in order to right the ship, right the republic, and get us back on the right track by reasserting our Article 1 authority, taking advantage of this moment that was given to us by the Supreme Court. And so that's where we stand right now. So very excited.
And this is, such an important next step to follow on. Yeah. Let's talk first. I want to talk about Chevron deference because you talked about the importance of this Supreme Court case and what it does. When we talk about deference, Chevron deference, just so people understand, essentially what that was doing was allowing a government agency to come in and they were deferred to, that what they were doing was correct. It was assumed that they were correct, which if, in any other court of law, if you go in, you've got a judge who is an arbiter. He's an impartial arbiter of the facts. Yeah. But what was happening with Chevron deference was that the government came in and it was assumed by a judge that they were correct in what they were doing, that they had the authority and they had the power to do those things. So this was an incredible sweeping Supreme Court decision that really set the balance of power back to the way our founders wanted it to be, correct?
Absolutely. It's the way I've been explaining it to some people, and this may be a bit rudimentary, but think of someone who just walked into your house and stole your grandmother's china, and you're standing there, and the police have been called, and then they're filing a report, and the thief looks dead at him and says, "No, I have a right to do this." And they look at you, the cops do, and then they look at him, and then they say, "You know what? I'm going to defer to him. He's right. He has a right to steal your grandmother's china." That's basically what it was.
Yeah, and what a great example of that. So let's talk about the REINs Act and the ability. I mean, this is only part of this Supreme Court decision. The Loper-Bright decision was only part of what needs to be done. As you said, it's very important now for Congress to come back in and take back their authority under Article 1 of the Constitution, so that we don't have these unelected bureaucrats doing this. Let me ask, let me give a couple of examples of this, and maybe you have better ones than this. The two I would use are the government student loan issue that Joe Biden decided he wanted to do that, and who cared if, in his mind, if Congress wanted it done or not. So he went ahead and tried to do it anyway, administratively. Then the other one I use as an example on this a lot of times are the fuel efficiency standards on automobiles. I mean, this is just done. It's a tax that's passed on to the American people because it increases the price of a new vehicle. But those things, that's not what Congress intended when they passed the laws that created these agencies. Do you have these examples? Do you agree with those? And maybe you have better examples.
I mean, honestly, those are some of the big, real shiny ones that everyone talks about. And you're 100% right. I mean, I think we all remember Nancy Pelosi now infamously saying in a press conference that Biden did not have the constitutional authority to forgive student loans. She said that and then was forced to eat her words and backtrack and backpedal for months and months and months. And, we're here in the early part of December. We're probably going to see more of that up until the time that he is kicked out of office and has to leave, because he still, in his mind, believes that he is above the law. Now, that's on top of some other horrific decisions that President Biden has made. But that's one of the big ones, because think about this. This is billions and billions of dollars that no law was ever passed. The Supreme Court said he didn't have the right to do this, and he did it anyway. And he's doing it through that administrative state, that administrative regime. And when you think about this, there is no student loan forgiveness. It doesn't exist. It is a debt transfer. And the thing that kills me is that for all these people that got degrees in underwater basket weaving and God knows what else, they're sitting there feeling very good about themselves that their student loans got forgiven, not realizing that they are, in fact, going to have to pay for it on the back end in the form of higher taxes, because there is no free lunch. And I may have minored in economics instead of majored in it, but even I know that there is no such thing as a free lunch. There is absolutely a debt that has to be paid, and it is going to impact every single person. And it's a real shame and a slap in the face to every person who put themselves through school, who worked hard, who sacrificed, who saved, to the parents and families that helped their kids go through college and did that. It's really a shame, because I think it cheapens all of the hard work and sacrifice that went into achieving those degrees and making a better path and a better life for themselves. But that's one of those best examples that I can think of. I mean, there's Jeff. If you ever want to go to sleep, like if you are suffering from insomnia, I highly recommend picking up the Federal Register. You will find the most boring, horrific thing in those pages. 11 of those pages is dedicated to regulating the size of spaghetti. Believe it or not.
It's crazy. Yeah. I don't have that much trouble sleeping. I don't think. But well, look, I mean, these are, and this is all at a time when you're talking about like the student loan forgiveness stuff. This is at a time when our country has almost $36 trillion in debt. Right. This would add to that by an action of the president when Congress didn't intend for that president to do it. That's why this is so important, right? At a time when our country is headed towards fiscal insanity, insolvency, really. And, to be able to rein in that, a president from going rogue and basically spending money that Congress didn't intend, that's exactly what our founding fathers expected out of us and expected out of the Constitution, right?
Absolutely. I mean, and that there's a couple of parts to this. So the fiscal side of it, 1,000%, $2 trillion. If we pass the REINS Act and it gets signed into law, that's $2 trillion that we immediately save, which is incredible. And that's a huge, huge number that's going to go a long way in the work that Elon and Vivek and others are going to be doing in trying to right the fiscal ship. The other part of this, though, is if you break it down per family, and I'll just use Florida as an example, as a Floridian, it's $14,000 to $15,000 more that every family in Florida is paying as a result of the regulations that have taken place under the Biden regime. That's $15,000 for not more goods, not more services, not an improvement. That's just an added on cost. And all those costs, that's just going to fuel and grow the size of government. And when people say, well, what's the problem with big government? Well, think about this. Every single one of those bureaucrats has a price tag, and they want to make sure that their role, their career is protected. So they look for more reasons and more ways to keep Americans dependent on their quote unquote services. In this case, their rules, the regulations. And so when you look at what the regulatory regime, this growth in the administrative state has done, it's created this culture of dependency and control. And there's a great book out there, Daniel Hanna. I have not read this book in probably 15 years. He was an MP, and he talked about the dangers of the administrative state and what had happened with the EU before Brexit. And really, it was based on it was called A New Road to Serfdom. Gosh, I need to go read that book again. It has been that long. But he really laid out the dangers of not just the economics of it. And to your point, you said we're on the cusp of $35 trillion in debt. People have no idea what that means. That means that the interest is now outpacing, the interest on our debt is now outpacing what we spend on our military. Right. That only about 30% of what we in Congress are fighting and squabbling over in terms of putting together a budget is discretionary, meaning the discretionary elements of government. That's the EPA, which, by the way, was never authorized by Congress. All of the Department of Education, HUD, all these agencies, the mandatories on autopilot. That's your Social Security, your Medicare, Medicaid, and a little bit of some defense in there, a little bit, not much. But that's on autopilot. We don't even touch that. So this is starting to snowball out of control. And there has only ever been one country in history that has come back from this ratio that we have of debt to GDP. And that was Japan. Now, we're going to have to make some very serious cuts to get us back on track. We're going to have to really pare down the size of government. But when you think about the cultural repercussions of having a regulatory regime, an unelected, nameless, faceless bureaucrat making decisions for you in Washington, you're basically undercutting the idea of our republic. Because me, as a member of Congress, I'm hired by 800,000 individuals here in Florida, and my job is to be their voice, their advocate. And what the administrative state says is, no, we don't give a crap about your advocate. We don't care about your constituents' voices. We know what's best for them. But no one elected them. They are acting outside of the bounds of their authority. So when we get to the heart of it, it's really about reasserting the people's voice, empowering the people. That's why the REINS Act is so important. If you pass the REINS Act, we get it signed into law. It gives the people, we the people, the power that was laid out for us so very clearly in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So it's a cultural element. It is a national security element, because we can't take care of business here at home if we're falling to pieces, if we aren't financially, fiscally sound. But it's also the economic side. So it's a lot of things at play here that we have to be mindful of. And the REINS Act, it is such a big piece of righting this ship. And that's why I'm so excited about it. Senator Rand Paul and I, we have worked on this bill together for the last 4 years. He's been working on it since before my time in office. And we even introduced an enhanced version of this bill this fall that allowed for an individual who had experienced direct harm as a result of these regulations to take on the government. And that is really important because, as we all know, you can never fight the government. It's an endless stream of resources. We want the little guy to be able to fight and have a fighting chance. And so the REINS Act, REINS Enhanced, all a very, very good, but very crucial first step in getting us back on track.
Let's talk about the REINS Act and what the bill would actually do once Congress passes it.
So it's pretty simple, actually, for having such a big punch and impact. It's actually pretty simple. It basically says that any major rule, which is defined by an impact of $100 million or more, which anything these days, basically you can sneeze at, you're going to spend $100 million by government standards. Any major rule or regulation that has $100 million or more of an industry impact, it doesn't have to be just one business, it's industry wide, has to then, before, and this is a key word, before it can go into effect, it has to come back to Congress for an up or down vote. That is the key point there, because that is your elected representative giving an up or down vote, kind of like, in Rome, in the Colosseum, it's up or it's down,
right. Yeah.
And since Gladiator just came out, I haven't seen the new Gladiator, but, I've seen the trailer for it. And of course, that's the infamous scene in it. But it puts your representative in the position as your voice to say, this is a good regulation, a needed regulation, or it's a bad one. And that is so critically important in, again, giving the voice and the power back to the people. And why this needs to happen, and a lot of people said, I thought this happened already. No. Bureaucrats will put out an economic impact statement. They have a comment period, and they are not bound by any rule regulation, which is ironic since that's all they do is issue them.
Right.
But they're not bound by any rules that say they have to listen to the comments, that they have to modify anything or do anything based on the economic impact study or any of the comments. It's just, to me, blows my mind. And so the only thing that we have in our toolbox right now to combat this is a CRA, a Congressional Review Act. And that's after this rule goes into effect and after it's done an insane amount of damage, pushed full industries out of business. And so that's why the REINS Act, it's the before, it's the precursor, it's the thing that has to happen before a rule can go into effect, not after. It's very proactive in making sure that nothing goes into effect that could be damaging. And that's a huge change that we have not had, but is very needed.
Yeah. Now, I assume you have some members of Congress that you've run into, that you've talked with, who don't support the bill. I find it hard to believe that a member of Congress who is there to represent their constituents and also who should jealously guard their responsibilities under Article 1, I would assume that they would support something like this. What arguments are you hearing from members that maybe don't support it or people on the other side?
So there's the spoken argument against the bill, and then there's the not so spoken argument against the bill. And I remember my very first debate on the House floor with the REINS Act. And I believe it might have been Jerry Nadler from New York, if I'm remembering correctly. And if that's incorrect, I apologize. But the Democrat on the other side of the chamber, as we were doing this back and forth debating, they said, this is unnecessary. This is absolutely unnecessary. We're not experts in this chamber. And I had to laugh because there's something that happens to members. And I thank God every day that I have wonderful family and friends that keep me very humble and grounded, because something happens when people get elected to office, especially in Congress. All of a sudden, people think, despite not having a background in any of these things, that they are a biologist, a chemist, an MD, a lawyer, a constitutional expert, an engineer, right? They're suddenly an expert in all things, and just ask them, they'll tell you. But in this moment, after hearing people for so long pretend, and some of them have legitimate issue area expertise, they say, well, we don't have enough intelligence amongst this body to determine whether or not this rule is necessary. We would rather defer to the experts. That's their argument, that Congress is not smart enough. They're not experts in the field that they would need to be in order to make a determination on whether a rule or regulation was needed. That's always been their pushback. And the second thing has been, it's going to be a lot of work. It's going to be a lot of work. And I have heard that both publicly in debate as well as privately when I get pulled aside and they say, this is going to add weeks to our schedule up here. Like, nobody has time for this. And I'm thinking, you SOB. Oh my gosh. I clean that up for you, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you.
I get infuriated because I grew up the daughter of a single mom who worked her tail off. And, to this day, we work, I believe, harder than anyone. We want to, of course, believe that. We always are our own competition. And it kills me when I hear members say, oh, well, that's going to add time to the session calendar. We'll be up here for weeks on end having to go through these regulations. And I'm like, that's what we were elected to do.
Right.
Not chase titles. We were elected to come up here and work.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that really just gets under my skin a little bit, is that they don't want to do the work. But now with the Reins Act, they're going to be forced to do the work, which is really important. But the other thing that is not spoken of publicly as the biggest reason why folks on the other side of the aisle would not want to pass this is because it basically ties that administrative state, or that the person who is in charge in the office at that time, it ties their hands behind their backs. And we've seen, and this is an equal opportunity offender moment, right? For decades, Republicans and Democrats have abused the administrative state. And so it's always been that unspoken thing of, well, he's got this very strong, aggressive political agenda. And so we're going to need to keep that intact so we can get that done. And I think of here recently, Joe Biden had said, we're going to come for your guns, right? And then, God forbid, if Kamala Harris had been elected, she wanted to do a mandatory gun buyback, which, again, that's a little bit of an oxymoron, because a mandatory gun buyback would be gun confiscation.
Right.
But during the Biden administration, they had come out with a rule on pistol braces. And the pistol brace is an accessory. And for the last 10, 12 years, ATF says we don't have the regulatory authority to go after accessories. We don't manage accessories, et cetera. Now, Biden makes a campaign promise to go after guns, right? Because they don't seem to realize that there's a mental health crisis in this country, and not once has a gun ever picked itself up and committed a crime. It's always the gun's fault, right? They decide with the stroke of a pen that they are going to now regulate the pistol braces, and that they need to have a serial number. And if you don't put a serial number and register your pistol braces, that it would be a fine and it would be a felony. So we went through with our Second Amendment Advisory Council, and they got us in touch with the manufacturers, and we went and did our own economic impact study. The total economic impact study for just this small regulatory action was over $1.8 billion with a B, $billion in industry impact. People, small mom and pop firearms dealerships, they would have absolutely been crushed. So that's an example of how they've used the administrative state to go after the political agenda, the campaign promises.
Yeah.
So it is so dangerous. And I just cannot believe to this day that people don't take more seriously the threat of these bureaucrats. And you can see it across the world of what's happening,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's this, some of those arguments that you laid out, it's kind of this Woodrow Wilson type belief that somehow if you just have people smart enough, they can run everybody else's lives for them. This isn't a question I expect you to answer, because none of us can. What makes somebody sitting in an agency an expert as opposed to a member of Congress who maybe was in that business for a long time, right? I mean, if you were a banker and you got elected to Congress, you're as much of an expert, if not more of an expert, than some bureaucrat who spent 30 years at, regulating banks. That doesn't mean that you're an expert in it. That's the first thing. The second thing that just really strikes me about the argument is it's going to cause too much work for Congress, well, then maybe that regulation shouldn't have been implemented. If it isn't that important for Congress to sit and spend the time on it, wouldn't it be great if that had to happen in order for a regulation to take effect? Because if we didn't have the time to do it, then the regulation wouldn't take effect. And that'd be a good thing for Americans, right? So,
exactly.
I mean, it's just crazy. And then I guess the last thing I'd point out on that is, I guess if you're a big government person who, or a member of Congress who wants government to regulate stuff, and you don't, if you really believed, and of course I don't believe this and you don't believe this, that gas stoves should be banned, you don't want to vote on that as a member of Congress, and you still want it done, you're going to hide under the administrative state and let them do it and do your dirty work for you, so you don't have to go back and explain it to constituents, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, those are the same people that want the massive thousands of pages of, legislation that's a single bill, right?
Yeah.
Me being a small government conservative, I want single issue bills and I want time to read the bills. The people who want to do away with the single issue bills and do away with any sort of time frame in order to read them, those are the ones that sneak all the garbage in at 2:00 in the morning and force you to vote on it at 7 a.m. Right. And so that's the thing that I come back to is, if you are serious about representing your constituents, you need to be able to tell your constituents what's in a bill. And the people who just quite frankly don't want to know, or they just don't care, or hey, I'm just going to shove as much stuff in here and I don't care what else is good or bad in it, I got my thing. I mean, those are the people that need to get out of Congress.
Right.
They have no business representing folks back home. They're good constituents and good people all around this country that deserve to have honest representation. We can have a difference of opinion. Absolutely. That's what makes this wild, crazy experiment work so well, is we have diversity of thought, but it gets corrupted when you have that type of arrogance and that type of self-serving attitude. And that's when, we have these debates about the REINs Act, and we've passed this bill out of the House twice now. We've passed it as a standalone on the House floor twice. And then I have to probably send him a Christmas card, but the poor parliamentarian, I've badgered him into, I feel like, submission. We actually were able to modify the language so that it could be attached to every appropriation bill that we put on the House floor. And that was a really innovative way to do it, because I figured if they're not going to pass this out of the Senate as a standalone, I'm going to force them to pass it by attaching it to an appropriation bill. And so we've been crafty in how we've been able to get this further and further along, but no matter what, it has constantly stopped or died in the Senate with their unwillingness to pick up an appropriation bill or to actually pick up a bill at all. There's the other side of it, though, that, you talked about, this alluding to the culture of, not wanting to work. It is true that Congress has gotten very lazy, and they have forgotten what it means to be a citizen legislator. They forgot what it means to go to Washington, represent, work very hard, and then come home. And you see that when you have folks like Nancy Pelosi, who has been in Congress longer than I've been alive. That, to me, is the epitome of someone who has focused on gaining power rather than doing good. And so that's part of the reason why the REINs Act is so important, is it's going to weed out the people who are there just to collect a paycheck. It's going to weed out the people who don't want to work, who don't want to be accountable to their constituents, who don't want to come home and explain every single vote. That is something that I have said all along from the beginning of, I'm going to read the bills. I'm going to come home, and you may not appreciate every vote that I take, but I'm going to come home every single time and I'm going to explain it. And we can disagree, but at least you're going to hear from me as to why I voted the way I did.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, and we have a country to save, right? I mean, this stuff is so important. And as you alluded, right, with the Loper-Bright decision, that's only part of the solution. That was a very important part of the solution, but now it has to be followed up by Congress stepping back in and pulling back some of their Article 1 authority. Now, even though we've got the Trump administration coming in, into office, how many pages did the Biden-Harris administration add to the Federal Register of regulations in the last year?
Oh, gosh. You had to ask me that, huh?
A lot? Is that the answer?
A lot. I could Google it really fast on my phone.
But no, that's okay.
Cheating.
You don't need to. I mean, but this is the problem. I mean, these regulations just keep getting added and added. On top of the other. And that's the problem. We've got to have a Congress that is willing to go through and look at those and say, these are important and these aren't.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what is expressly laid out for Congress to handle and what is expressly laid out under the 10th Amendment for the states.
Yeah.
And, we have done so much to interfere in so many industries and so many issues that Congress has no federal jurisdiction to actually be a part of.
Right.
You'd asked how many regulations they've added. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head because they're literally adding so many every single week. I can tell you that it is more than the last 3 presidents combined.
It's amazing.
And that was at last time I checked it. But it's more than just the regulations, though. And so I'm going to put in a plug for another bill that we have that we're working on, and it's called the USA Act. I know this was not flagged for you, so
that's okay.
Just roll with me.
I will
Jeff.
roll with you. That sounds good.
But the USA Act, it is the Unauthorized Spending Act, which basically says that unless a program or an agency has been expressly authorized by Congress, that it cannot be funded. Now, I know that sounds like it's something that's probably already happening. I'll let you all in on a dirty secret. It's not.
Right. Unfortunately.
It is not.
Right.
And I'll give a great example in the EPA. All of us want clean air and clean drinking water and a very clean, safe, thriving environment. Guess what? The EPA has never been authorized by Congress, and yet we fund it every single year. And so one of the things that this bill would force us as Congress to do, which I'm kind of, maybe I'm a glutton for punishment. Maybe there's a super sneaky part of me that wants to make Congress work and work really hard. It would force us as a representative body to actually sit down and go through every program and every agency and make a determination of, is this, 1, the role of the federal government? And 2, do we have the money for this? And then 3, are we actually going to authorize it? Because if it's not authorized, then it shouldn't be funded. And I know that sounds very elementary, but right now, through these CRs and these omnibuses, you have so many programs that Congress never, ever authorized being funded. And they're accountable, again, to no one. They just kind of exist in perpetuity. So the USA Act, in conjunction with the REINS Act, will be 2 huge steps in getting us to a place where the American people would know that their taxpayer dollars are being spent wisely and that they would actually be able to keep more money in their pocket rather than giving it to these unelected bureaucrats.
Yeah, that's very important. And of course, very few committees in Congress authorize anything. I know the National Defense Authorization Act is the sort of the exception. It generally has gone through most years, but other than that, they don't authorize these things. It's all done through the appropriators, and that's not the way the process is intended to work. It's not how our founding fathers intended it to work, and it's not the way that Congress is set up to run. So they're just doing an end around that. So thank you for that, the work on that as well. I wanted to ask you, and we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask you, you and Senator Scott from your great state of Florida have introduced a bill called the Increasing Values for Families with HSAs Act. Yeah. What will this bill do?
So again, as a big proponent of somebody who wants the American people to keep more of their money in their pocket rather than giving it to bureaucrats, this would allow for families and individuals to save more of their money tax-free so that they could use it on IVF. Mm-hmm. Now, having a family is one of the core pieces. It's a foundational part of the American dream for so many people. And it's getting harder and harder for a lot of the families that I know. Certainly my generation, I have a lot of friends that have struggled with fertility, and they've used IVF to have their families, grow their families, but it's very expensive. In Florida alone, it's on average it could be $10,000 to $30,000 just for a cycle. And on average, some families do up to 6 cycles before they are successful with IVF. And so you're looking at a huge chunk of money, up until, the cost of a house, basically, in some cases, just in order to have a child. And so this bill, it's very simple. It just basically says we stand with families and we want you to have more of your hard-earned money tax-free so that you can have a family if this is something that you need. And it doubles the amount that an individual can save in a tax-free savings account for fertility services. So it's a very simple bill. We're very excited about it, very proud of this work because, again, having a family, it's part of the American dream. And we should be getting out of people's way and out of their wallets so that they can do just that.
Yeah. Well, a great bill. And, but hope that you are able to get that passed. I'm a big fan, too, of just increasing the availability of HSAs to the American people. I was stunned to find out as I was doing this podcast many episodes ago, maybe 200 episodes ago, that HSAs are only about 10% of Americans can even use HSAs because you have to have the high deductible plan. Why in the world would not every American be allowed to have tax-free savings for healthcare if that's what they choose to do, if that's the plan that they choose? And this would even allow people to use it for IVF. So that's a great thing. Well, listen, Congresswoman, you're doing great work. I tell you, the REINs Act, I guess this is my last question for you. Obviously, a new administration, the Trump administration coming in, Congress now has control, of course, had control of the House, will still have control of the House, will now have control of the United States Senate. What are the chances that we could pass and get the president to sign the REINs Act?
So everyone is talking about this 4 years that we're going to have, which, if I'm being honest, we're really only going to have 2, because historically, after a new president is elected, they lose the midterm elections in the House spectacularly. So we are anticipating losing the House in the midterms, which everyone who is in the know right now is operating under that assumption. So with 2 years to really make incredible, lasting, multi-generational change, REINs Act is at the top of the list. We know that without having a 60 number in the Senate, that the Senate would probably never pass the REINs Act as a standalone, which means we need to attach it to a larger vehicle. Now, this flies in the face of the single issue bill, but in extraordinary circumstances, with a once in a lifetime opportunity to radically transform Washington and drain the swamp, I'm willing to make an exception.
Yeah.
So that vehicle that we're talking about is called budget reconciliation. Right. And it's kind of an all things taxes, because as many people know, at the end of this year, at the end of 25, we have the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that President Trump created and passed. A lot of those are sunsetting, which means that families everywhere under every tax bracket will experience a tax increase if we don't make those permanent. So we have a lot of work to do in the tax reform front in making sure that we're keeping taxes low. And so that is going to be part of the budget reconciliation. And as we've been working through this in the last year, we've gone through and worked with a lot of outstanding groups, outside groups, Americans for Prosperity, the Foundation for Government Accountability. There's so many out there, Americans for Tax Reform, all these phenomenal groups that are out there that have worked with us on the REINs Act. We've put together a blueprint of how the REINs Act could be slightly tweaked to be included legislatively and parliamentary sound within budget reconciliation, which would then go to the Senate. The Senate would be forced to sign it, and then President Trump would sign it.
Right.
Now, people say, why in the heck would a president give away their power? Well, it's because President Trump recognizes that it was never his power to begin with. And he's always been about America first and empowering people. And so this is his way of recognizing that there is no, third term, right? There's not a re-election that he has to worry about. He's going all in on transformative, multi-generational change to give this country another shot at 250 plus years of our republic. And so the Senate's going to be the holdup, but I think we have a path and a plan to get it through and across the finish line.
And anything in budget reconciliation has to positively, positively impact spending. right? And so it's got to have that tie to it. And so this certainly is going to have that. You just got to work with the parliamentarian. And I know you're doing that. This is very important.
Bless his heart.
Very important work that you're doing to get that to be part of the budget reconciliation process. So listen, Congresswoman, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us, but thanks for all the great work that you're doing on this. The REINS Act, this is really important stuff. And I think as we look at transformation, this has the greatest potential to transform Washington out of really anything out there, I think, is the REINS Act and Congress doing that and pulling back some of that Article 1 authority that they have. So thanks for all you're doing.
Well, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to talk about it. It's not the sexiest topic in the world. People tend to, go towards the more headline grabbing stuff. But like you said, this is potentially the most transformative piece of legislation to get us back on track. And we're going to pour every blood, sweat, and tear we possibly can to get it across the finish line so we can actually once and for all drain the swamp. You bet. All right. Well, Congresswoman Kat Cammack, thank you for joining us. Appreciate you being with us. Thank you, Jeff. Great to see you. You bet. All right. Well, listen, this is what a transformative thing this can be for America. And so I would just urge you to pick up the phone right now and call your member of Congress and ask them to pass the REINS Act, to sign on to the REINS Act and do everything that they can in your U.S. member of Congress and your member of the U.S. Senate, your two U.S. senators. Ask them to sign on to this legislation and to do everything they can to get it passed. Liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Don't take it for granted. Go out there, fight to defend liberty and freedom. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.